Welcome, members of Conway MacKenzie. If you could please introduce yourselves.
It's on.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, board members, Secretary Suarez. I'm here with my colleague, Wade Johnson, who has been working together with the Conway team since a bit less than 2 years ago when we first started to advise the Commonwealth in evaluating the liquidity situation. My name is Aurelio Garcia Miró. I am the partner for Conway MacKenzie covering Latin America, and I've been leading this team, has been working hand in hand with the Commonwealth for the last several months. So the Financial Oversight and Management Board requested Conway MacKenzie's assessment of the Commonwealth liquidity. This presentation will be mainly focused on the Treasury single account, which I will define and to give an overview about in the following pages. But this Treasury single account pools and concentrates around 2/3 of the overall Commonwealth flows during any given period of time. So my intention today is aligned with the request of the board to provide the board with an overview to facilitate the understanding about what is the TSA, what is the updated cash flow forecast for the current fiscal year, what are the recent historical cash trends that reflect how deficits have been covered, what measures have been implemented to preserve cash, what are the proceeds from the moratorium, what is the structure of the Commonwealth's financial debt, what debt is being paid currently, and what are other key considerations that we would like to highlight for the board and other stakeholders. Let me start by defining what our role has been in the last several months, because I think it provides some context on the way we're going to present our assessment today. We were originally engaged by the Commonwealth to provide a static assessment of the liquidity of the Commonwealth, which we produced and presented back in August of last year. There was a one-off static evaluation of the current liquidity situation at the time and the cash flow forecast for the next 2 fiscal years. Subsequent to that analysis, we then focused on the cash projections for 5 component units, which are governmental entities that have separate treasuries and separate cash accounts, as several other component units. We focused on 5, which were ASES, ASEM, UPR, PRITA, and PBA, which together with other large component units like HTA, PBA, and PREPA would correspond to the largest component units with independent treasuries. And the last 3 we didn't cover because they already have advisors monitoring their cash. Subsequent to that, we have been, since late last year and throughout this year, advising the Commonwealth in producing the different scenarios of cash projections in the period pre-moratorium and then subsequent to the moratorium. In that role, we have been, as opposed to in the first months, we have not been monitoring the day-to-day management of the cash, which has been managed by Treasury, especially since the accounts were switched from the GDP, given the situation of the GDP, into the other commercial banks, mainly Banco Popular. So in the last several months, what we have been doing is coordinating closely with Treasury on monitoring the cash flows that they're producing, and we are adjusting based on different assumptions. And we will see how those are reflected in our projections that we're presenting subsequently. So in page 4, we have a description of what area of the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth activities are covered by the TSA. The TSA, as I said before, pools or channels or concentrates up to 2/3 of the Commonwealth. And it does it by concentrating the inflows or receipts that come from the general fund, most of the federal funds or federal transfers, governmental debt issuance, or GO, and other Commonwealth debt. And then there's also some revenues that come from either pledge revenues or, in addition to that, non-general fund funds. The agencies that are included in the TSA, fully included, correspond to the governmental agencies which do not have independent treasury, but are managed, all of their treasury and cash is managed in a pool, which is a treasury single account. There's other entities that have, as I said before, separate treasury functions, but however, are to some extent dependent on monies from the general fund or federal fund that are transferred through the TSA to feed their cash flows. And these entities, and we're putting a list which is by no means comprehensive, but I think indicative, includes component units such as the UPR, ASES, BREPA, PRASA, ASEM, HTA, PBA, the pension funds, municipalities, and the COFINA fund. And the list is much broader, but I think that we're presenting here the main entities that are to some extent depending on funds that flow from the TSA into those entities. Now, in the next slide, I want to present our view of the latest forecast for fiscal year 17. As I said before, the way we have produced this cash flow is as follows. The Puerto Rico Treasury forecasts their cash on a daily basis, sometimes even more than once during a given day. And they do it with a tool that they use in order to accomplish one goal. Puerto Rico Treasury wants to make sure that they keep a positive balance of cash in the TSA account. That's their goal. That's where they manage for, and that's where their forecasting tools are made for. So they updated it on a daily basis based on actuals through the day, and they're reforecast through the end of the fiscal year. That's the way they do it. So what we have been doing since early this year, when they switched the accounts to the Banco Popular and other commercial banks, it's been receiving their view of the cash flow, and we have been treating it or adjusting it for different assumptions. The request that we had for today was, let's present a cash flow that reflects the current law as it is. All obligations when they're due, and all obligations that have not been paid during the moratorium become due at the time the moratorium expires. So we have included those assumptions or reflections of reality of the current law into the forecast provided by Treasury. So this slide provides a graphical explanation of where do we see the cash flow going this year. We start the year with a bank cash of $244 million in the TSA. At the same time, there were checks outstanding in excess of $350 million, if I'm not wrong, same date, meaning that the book amount or value of cash was negative to start the year. However, we're still going to do the projections on the actual bank value of cash, which is 244. Between June and February of this fiscal year, there is a small deficit on operations from the cash flow. That brings the cash stock or cash balance before any debt service to $104 million. If, as expected, the moratorium expires and it's not revolved in any of its considerations, by the end of January, there is an expected debt service due that includes arrears from prior years plus everything due through end of February of up to $1.3 billion. That's our first maturity wall this year. And then subsequently, there's a second maturity wall during the month of June of approximately $935 million. With this prognosis, we see the cash balance of the TSA going to negative $2.2 billion by the end of the year. If we consider other pending amounts due, including withheld pledge revenues, clawback amounts, and PFC, PREFA, and other dues, the negative amount of cash projected for the end of the year could go up to $3 billion. So on the next page, I want to highlight other key risks that we see in the short-term horizon that I want to bring up to the attention of the board today. First risk I want to mention is associated with the ACA funds. And there's a, oh, sorry. There you go. So there's a significant risk of approximately $800 million would hit the cash of the TSA by 2018. Then there's another risk associated to the sunsetting of the excise provision of Act 154 that could add another risk of $500 million in early 2018. There's a risk on the pensions. As we all know, liquid assets of the pension systems are being exhausted. And based on latest information, we have to adjust the expected date. Until a few weeks ago, we had anticipated that they might be exhausted in 2018. We need to figure out if there's an earlier date than that for such exhaustion. There's another risk associated with the special revenue funds. These are funds that are not part of the annual budget, but are created with special laws or legislation. And even if the current administration have been addressing those special revenue funds or non-general fund funds, we believe that there still needs to be a process to identify them and eliminate any potential deficit coming from those historical funds. There's litigation expenses that we consider will be real and happening as soon as the moratorium and the stay is lifted or expires. There's potential deterioration of component unit liquidity, especially we see risk of ASM, assess. And then from the cash management perspective, with all these risks and the prior described prognosis, we also need to be aware that the top line or the revenues coming into the TSA are markedly skewed towards the end of the year, especially in the last year, because of a seasonality of tax collections. And whereas the Commonwealth was able to fund anticipated tax collections at the beginning of the year, stabilize the cash flow. Well, access to the markets and to that type of funding, even short-term funding or intra-year funding, is not available or is available at a very high cost. So that is also limiting Treasury's ability to manage cash under this circumstance. In the next section, we will cover the recent historical cash trends of last year's cash flow. Try to identify how did we get here. So this slide is a graphic representation of recent historical TSA cash flows. We can see that these are the red boxes or bars represent the net financing funds or represent the cash flows before debt. And this line represents the amounts of accounts paid or suppliers' payments compared to the number of days outstanding for the payables. So all we want to show here is that whereas historically the cash flows before that were being negative, generating an operational deficit, let's call it that way. That was covered by new net financing. Since the year fiscal year 15 onwards, access to markets and capacity to fund through new net financing has not been as much available or in the conditions that would make it feasible. And then there's been an increased modus of financing through suppliers and taxpayers with tax refunds.
So essentially, you're saying that the payables from suppliers, the amount has trended down somewhat, but the days outstanding has doubled in this period.
That is correct.
Yeah, and basically it's replacing the external working capital financing.
That is correct. I want to, for sake of clarity, I want to make sure there's a box there that states it, but I want to on the record. This analysis is an analysis that Conway MacKenzie is doing based on the information that we can extract. We all know that there's no balance sheet available since 2014, at least no official, so we do our own estimations, and these numbers might vary, but those trends are the ones that we believe are representative as of today. But yes, your point is exactly the one that I'm trying to make. Mm-hmm. The next slide will present of fiscal year 16, last year's cash flow. So, first of all, I mean, let's be aware of this. We started the year with $14 million. The Treasury account has ins and outs of approximately $18 billion per year. So starting with a 14 million account is almost some hours of the first day that can be at play for swings in cash. In addition to that, at the time, there were 429 million of checks outstanding. Those correspond to checks either in the vault that had been spitted by the automated process that keeps printing checks without noticing that there's no money at the bank to pay them, or checks in the system. So a combination of both added up to 429. And when I say checks in the system, it's checks being sent to be paid and not yet cashed.
A question, if I may, rough estimate of accounts payable on top of that negative, that real negative starting deficit of about 415 million?
Around 1.2, if I'm not wrong. I need to fine-tune that estimate, but that would be my guess. Billion, which are accounts payable net of, some claims and from police and for other litigations that are contingent to, if we clean them up and we try to get into the accounts payable that will really affect the cash flow in the next couple of years, I would say that it's around 1.2 in addition to those.
And that would be in addition to the outstanding checks? That's net of the outstanding checks withheld?
Yes,
Okay.
that is the case. The outstanding checks are counted.
They're not counted as payables anymore
They're
because
counted
there's a
as
check,
payable.
but, yeah, okay.
So a way of thinking of it is they start for the fiscal year with a negative cash balance of $1.6 billion after doing things like not paying the pension systems, which you remind us, that's likely not going to be in the near future, given the fact that the pension systems are also facing a liquidity problem and going negative on cash.
Yes, from our standpoint, I see that the real effect in cash, in the cash balance
Yeah.
and the asset is coming from checks that have been printed, whereas, the accounts payables are accounts payable and you can still manage it. So we wouldn't consider it necessarily negative, but yes, it will hit the cash in the short term, yes. So that's the point. It's important that we focus on that starting point for last fiscal year. You have net cash flows before that of almost $1 billion. Those include approximately $440 million from clawback proceeds, those 993. And then you have agencies, lines of credit, which were lines provided by GDP historically, and this year it's not happening, for another $276 million. And then you have trans, which were these tax anticipation notes. And because of the difficulty to access the market, these were trans that were generated with a pool of governmental entities that provided cash to finance. This 400 trans compares to historical trans of between 1 and 1.4 billion in anticipation of revenue. So it was already reduced. So that's what builds up the cash amount available for debt service to 1.7 billion. And then we're presenting here the different parts of the cascade down to the end cash, and that includes payments to GDP of 62 million, repayment of the fiscal year 16 trans that that could not be paid in the prior year, so needed to be paid in that year. The repayment of the transfer of that year in order to be able to try to renew financing this year. And then debt service, 346, and the net transfer to clawback accounts of 290, which I'm going to address later on, where those 290 million went to.
And which debt service is this, 346?
That's
General obligation.
partial payment of general.
Partial payment of the general obligation, okay.
And it's all the general obligation, the 346?
No, it does not include all of it.
But that's what that number is. That's the only thing that's been paid, is a...
Yes. I have to clarify, because COFINA doesn't get into TSA,
Right.
we're not accounting for COFINA payment here. That's it.
This is excluding COFINA.
This is excluding COFINA.
Could you also explain what the $62 million of GDP entails?
Yes, so there's monies paid for APLA bonds that were paid in the beginning of the fiscal year and carry over from appropriation debt from fiscal year 2015.
So that's debt service too?
Correct.
Okay.
So, whereas there's that would lead us to an end cash position of 244, and that's inclusive of 250 million that got trapped in the GDP and are not available for Treasury.
Exclusive of that, exclusive of GDP?
The 244 are exclusive of the 200.
Are net of the, okay.
So the true balance would have been $494 million, but you have $250 million that are trapped at GDB, and that's why you get to 244? Is that the correct math?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
And 308 million outstanding checks withheld.
That is correct.
And what is the projection of account payables to get a true sense of the negative potential balance?
About 1.6,
About 1.6.
1.5, 1.6. I'm sorry that I precise numbers. We have several sets of estimations that we do and we share and we compare with. But
Just to be able to frame it, so this assumes that this debt service that already has been paid gets paid. It assumes that no other debt service will be paid during the rest of the year, and still there will be a negative balance of about, assuming the outstanding checks and the accounts payable, there's going to be about $1.3 billion, $1.4 billion.
Well, this is fiscal year 2016, so this was at the end of June.
Also,
30,
this is the end of June
this is
2016.
how, that's the picture to start.
For
this.
next year. This is a picture to start fiscal year 2017.
Start this year.
So this is as of June 30, 2016.
Exactly.
Did I hear you, did you say 1.5 billion owed to local suppliers? Is that what you're?
Yes. 1.5. 1.556 is the latest number that we have, 1.5 to 1.6.
So just to be clear, you're just doing a reconciliation to the $244 million that you provided on the slide number 4. Okay, thank you.
That is correct. In the next section, I will try to cover different actions and measures taken by the Commonwealth to preserve cash. These measures include 4 categories: moratorium, or not paying debt; working capital, which is stretching supplier payments and tax refunds. You have budgetary measures that we will describe, and you have some enforcement measures to increase revenues. So in this slide, we have presented 2 sides. The left-hand side reflects those measures that we consider of longer term duration. And when we say longer term, we refer to the fact that our measures that survive the change between one fiscal year and another fiscal year. So at least they last for more than one fiscal year. And on the right-hand side of the slide, we're just showing some other measures that will not be reflected in the beginning or end cash balances of a year because they were just intra-year working capital financing activities. Okay? I think that the relevant thing to pinpoint here is that most of the measures in the left-hand side box correspond to non-payment of debt. And these are well known for many reasons. However, I would like to point you to the last 2 rows of that table, which are the account payable deferral and the deferral of payments to government entities, because those 2 correspond about $350 million that grew over already increased basis of accounts payable at the start of the year. So that's how the Commonwealth has been financing, and that's one of the things that in the fiscal plan that we're not going to present today, the fiscal plan, but are critical, how much money can be extracted from the system of the local economy, right?
Can you give an example of deferrals of payment to government entities? What government entities, what payments, for example?
I can give you a couple of types, and then I can ask Wade to fill in if necessary. Typically, you will have deferral of payments for services provided, like accounts payable to PREPA for
Okay.
light. You can also have budgetary appropriations, like the formula to UPR or to PBA, the appropriations to PBA or to other component units, which are monies. For the government, it's left pocket, right pocket, but for the Treasury, it's left pocket and out of TSA. So what they do is they stretch some of those appropriations either during the year or crossing the year until very early next year. So those are typical situations.
Well, you relieve right pocket, but you strain the left pocket, so
Exactly.
it's not.
So you put the pressure on another Treasury outside the TSA scope. For the budgetary measures,
The the intra-year, did you say the previous slide?
oh, sorry.
Previous slide? Anything to comment on the right-hand side, the intra-year liquidity measures?
I think that the general story here is that last year, after we presented the static view of the cash flow, I mean, the obvious question that came after that is, so what? I mean, we were presenting a 500 million shortfall in cash by the end of last fiscal year if there were no actions taken. And we believe that fiscal agency, the bank, and the government put together a team to figure out how to survive and go through those cash situations. So I think that now there's a lot of capacity to some of the intra-year peaks of cash requirement, like, for example, using pension advancement proceeds. The leeway to do that this year is shortened, and next year will not be there, right? So suspension of set-asides is a one-off. After you get the moratorium, it's not a continuous source of financing, right? So I think that there's just been, those are very indicative that there's been a lot of actions to manage the cash positive throughout this pressure. That's what I would like to.
What you're saying essentially is that it's a lot of measures that move money from one side to the other or delay the payments, but no substantive reduction in any commitments, really.
Those measures, no, those are measures from Treasury and to preserve cash balances. Those are just to let us go, to earn time until there was a decision whether there was, an option to go and refinance or do whatever needed to be done in order to sustain the real cash shortfall, right?
Measures really implemented to substitute the monies that historically have been funded through an external trans because of the timing of the revenues.
So they are palliative measures, but not remedial measures to the underlying
Those no.
cash flow concern. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
But if we go to the next slide, I would ask Wade to walk us through some of the budgetary measures that some of them could be defined more like either structural or oriented to longer-term cures.
So we've been talking about liquidity, but I'm going to try to relate this to liquidity in the end here, but I'm going to give an overview of the budgetary measures, specifically measures the Commonwealth has taken in fiscal 2016 to deal with the overestimation of revenues during the budgeting process. So to give you a little historical perspective, at the beginning of fiscal 2016, the legislature passed a 9.8 balanced budget, meaning there was 9.8 of revenues, 9.8 of expenditures. 5 months into the fiscal year, Treasury revised its initial $9.8 billion estimate to $9.3 billion. So in order to rebalance the budget, the government had to come up with a number of reductions to the approved budget in order to bridge that budgetary deficit. So what happened was the Commonwealth took $500 million of budget reductions, and these I'd say about $400 million relate to debt. And then the other relate to just general reductions in agency operating expenses and also elimination of payments to GDB and ERS. And this is going to relate back to the problem with, historically the government has overstated revenues going into the budgeting process, and they had to go through this exercise frequently. So the implication of this on the broader scope of liquidity is that through the overestimation of revenues, the primary levers to bridge those budgetary gaps are, 1, reduction in payments to the pension systems, and 2, elimination of payments on appropriation debt to GDP. And both of those have been realized in the full extent today. So, I mean, to give this, broader, and this applies to other entities as well. So, to give it a context of the broader liquidity scope that we're talking about.
Thank you, Wade.
Understood.
I mean, one question, after that revision, I mean, based on the work that you have done, I mean, do you feel that that number of $9.3 billion is still a plausible number of revenues for this fiscal year based on the cash flows that you have seen and on the collections? Or there's a further risk that this number might still be overstated and there's still another shortfall of several hundreds of millions of dollars?
As of today, the revenues this problem doesn't exist today as we see it. $9.045 billion is the revenue estimate today for the general fund, and the budgeted expenses are roughly about $200 million under that because of budgetary reserves and really budgetary measures to keep kind of a buffer between those two to avoid this problem.
So year to date, fiscal year to date, the actual revenues are so far in line with that latest
Estimate.
revenue estimate.
Budget.
Correct.
Okay.
It is budget, with the budget,
No, understood.
Yeah.
Okay.
yes. If we go to this next slide, this is a description of a very relevant initiative taken by Treasury. And it's we're summarizing here Treasury's tax compliance or enforcement plan. What we're expecting and supporting as much as we can is in converting these initiatives into a measurable plan where the real effects from the technology upgrades, the enforcement measures can be tracked, monitored. I think that there's a real effort being done here. The e-filings, for example, is a great step forward in efficiencies for anticipating revenues and broadening the scope. But again, this type of plan can only self-fulfilling if you can attach a constant way to monitor it on a monthly basis or periodic basis. I think that's what's needed, so that you can compare for any swing for any trend in the top line, how much of that is enforcement versus how much of that is economic and other variables. So this is going to be, I think it's a good basis, but we'd like to see it measured and monitored systematically. So in the next section, I want to cover our understanding of the uses of the clawbacks and moratorium monies. When doing so, I will refer to mainly those funds that are associated with the TSA. We have some information pertaining to entities outside the TSA, but the ones that we have been able to validate and vet and are the ones in the TSA, which are, by the way, most of them. So this graphical slide shows year-to-date, July to September, what are the total monies that have affected the Treasury single account positively. And the amount is 653 million. In the middle columns, we're breaking it down into how much of those 653 million correspond to clawbacks and how much correspond to moratorium. In the boxes to the right of the chart, you see a very colorful array. And the green boxes represent the monies that are either available to pay debt or have been used to pay debt. In red, you will see that our monies that have been set aside from clawbacks and are deposited in the GDP, but because of the situation of GDP, we consider it trapped cash. And finally, in the yellow box, you see the that are coming from the moratorium and have been commingled into the Treasury single account, and those are being used for operational coverage of the TSA cash flow. So just to be clear, 164 million, circa 164 million have been used to pay the partial payment of GEO debt back in July. 146 million are in an account, earmarked account, separate to the TSA at Banco Popular. 144 million, or approximately that number, are in the GDP in a separate account. And the 200 million of a moratorium, as I said before, have just got into the TSA and are being used for operational purposes. We assume that the moratorium can generate another 140 million through the end of a fiscal year that will continue to be channeled into the TSA. The box in the bottom makes reference to approximately 117 million of other moratorium proceeds that have gone into other entities with separate treasuries, like ERS, UPR, PR, HTA, and PRITCO. And then the Desarrollos Universitarios. Those are the ones that we have in the radar, and those are the funds, but as I said before, we haven't necessarily validated where these funds are, or we just know that they have been channeled to those entities. For the next section, I will ask Wade to walk us through a brief overview of the debt structure and debt that is being currently paid.
So the purpose of this page is to give you guys and everyone else a view of the complexity, one, of the debt, and two, kind of how they're all being paid and how they relate to all the tax revenues and ultimately the TSA. And you can see how the structure of the debt relies on Commonwealth taxing power, and I would say a majority of these revenues are collected through the TSA. So kind of gives you a feel for how the clawbacks work and the moratorium. We stop sending these revenues from the TSA to these debts and these entities for debt service payments. And then the following slide gives you the detail as to what is being paid and what is not being paid. So I think the simple way of putting this is all the debt shown there, excluding COFINA, is either not being paid or being paid from reserves. Now, one thing I should note on the schedule is what's in the box below, that this excludes PREPA, PRASA, some of FICA debt, some HTA debt, and those are all being paid with the exception of this PRASA rural development debt, which is in forbearance. And the reason why you may not see a lot of missed payments there is because these are being paid from reserves. So as these reserves deplete, you will see a lot more defaults.
Can you point out where on the slide you're talking about? I'm having trouble following.
Because here, here's the line.
This one?
So what's being paid?
COFINA, right here.
Okay.
So just because of the nature of the collection of these revenues.
Right.
And then these here are being paid from existing reserves or being partially paid. And then here you can see when the reserve will actually deplete. These are estimates, but based on the current balances.
Okay, thanks, that's helpful.
Okay.
So, considerations, I would like to point out three simple but I think quite relevant points. The liquidity crisis, in our view, is real, has been real since 2 years ago. There's been a lot of efforts to stretch all possible levers to preserve cash. But this is not a Treasury thing. This is a financial thing that is just representing a real deficit situation and a structural problem. Not only a historical problem, but a problem that needs to be addressed. In our opinion, there's very short-term challenges, maturity walls that need to be faced. There's not a lot of short-term tools available. Therefore, we think that two critical currencies that the Commonwealth needs to bring to the table are a fiscal plan that can provide credibility to all stakeholders and build consensus into a way forward, and then continued or increased or improved transparency in order to provide visibility and capacity to make decisions, rational decisions and confident decisions. And we believe that the combination of those two is an effort that corresponds to several parties in order to be credible, reliable, and sustainable into the future, into the implementation, to be more than just a document, but something that can be implemented and actionable. With that in hand, I think there needs to be a bridge until the implementation of that plan. So I think that other than that, there's no magic bullet here that will cushion the hit against the wall in February, and especially the combination of maturities between February and June. That's how we see the situation at this point.
I have a final question. How was your job? Your final point here is that existing tools and processes are inadequate at the Treasury Department. In your experience, and you do this for a living, how inadequate are Treasury's cash management, revenue estimation tools for the job at hand?
I would say they're materially poor. I would say that there's a very relevant team, very lean, small, concentrated team of people who need to deal with the difficulties of the systems, processes, or lack of processes, especially, I mean, Treasury is the last point in a whole chain of events. So I think that the problems start at the agency level, from the agency and their systems integration, planning, ledgers, accounting processes, and then all of that builds up from several, I mean, just the general fund, it has 140 entities. It's a big corporation. And you have about 5 different accounting systems that do not communicate to each other. So, I mean, all of that, at the end of the day, Treasury what gets is a check, is a Department of Education will need to pay all of these suppliers, and they have about 1 week of notice between when those those accounts payable that are already approved for payment at the Education Department are actually batched into Treasury system, and then Treasury has 7 days before a check will be issued, right? So that lack of visibility is very hard. I think that, however, also based on my personal experience and our experience as a firm, systems implementation, integration is much needed, needs to start now. It's not going to be a short-term fix. I think that in that respect, a lot of enforcement of processes with what they have today, just implementing and enforcing processes at the agency level could help the Treasury team. And I also think that we increase and improve monitoring capabilities for the expenses. There's no, if you don't have ledger,
There is no disbursement control, essentially.
interim during the year, no. All you can do is communicate reserves and put some reserves and control payroll. You can control payroll, and payroll is it's an important expense item, right? For sure. You can control some of the contractual expenditures if you see that they're getting near contracts, or you can just cut the contract. But the day-to-day payments at the agency level, you will not be able to control with what they have on hand right now. And that can provide swings, material swings to expenses. So an improved set of processes and systems could also alleviate OMB's director's job a lot, I think.
You mentioned with addressing a liquidity crisis is real section. I think you mentioned the term bridge. You would need a bridge to close the gap between the 104 million and the 1.3 billion. Even assuming if there were such a bridge available, what would happen if nothing else changed at the end of next year? In other words, would you be in the same position again?
Yes. And that's why that bridge needs to be contingent to a plan that addresses the problem, right? That's what I'm saying, that there needs to be consensus on the fact that that the plan is being implemented and will address part of what brought us here, right? So yes, it's not a bridge to nowhere. It would be just extending and amending, and or extending and pretending. And there needs to be, if there's an extension of any type, has to be contingent that the next thing forward is of an approved and agreed upon consensualized way to go.
Can you say anything generally about which payments are being made, which vendors are being paid, and which ones aren't? Is there any strategy for making that distinction that you're aware of?
I am aware that there is a protocol that is being followed on a day-to-day by Treasury professionals and officers. But I don't know which specific vendors are being paid or not. I don't know. I assume those are the vendors that are providing real essential services from one consideration, the consideration that if they cannot provide that service tomorrow, regardless of whether it's more important than, on the longer term than other welfare considerations. If the bus drivers are not paid tomorrow, then the kids don't go to school, perhaps, and then you need to make that decision today, right? Because you're dealing with the day-to-day urgency. But a list or protocols, those are managed, I think, very, at that point, there's a lot of discipline on how they're managing those payments to make sure that there's money in the account and they still can.
So it's not a distinction between essential services and non-essential services. It's just what we have to pay today to keep it going.
Well, there is a definition of essential services by the government, and within those essential services, that's what I was trying to say. There's a competition, right? And the priority is which one you need to pay tomorrow in order to keep that essential service really going tomorrow. That's the way I assume it's taking place. But again, I'm not part of the daily decision, but that's my understanding.
But in a sense, the way that you're describing it, it seems that every expenditure is currently being considered an essential service. Because, I mean, when you look at, when you describe the measures that have been taken lately to be able to deal with the budget challenges, I mean, the eliminations have been basically, mostly, you stated, debt service. So basically, if everything has stayed the same, obviously that's why the problem continues to be sustainable and systematic. And going back to the question about the bridge, you could have a bridge, but if you don't solve the root problem, I mean, this is a problem that will continue to go on and on and on and on.
Correct.
If I may, on that point, though, the things that you're highlighting are intra-year solutions, so there may be other elements that are embedded in the budget plan that are not being separately called out in terms of other reductions. So the starting point for this projections when we're looking at budgetary measure is the budget as it was enacted. Sometimes the budget as enacted includes some policy choices, and within the course of the year, you're highlighting what are the additional things that are done over the course of the year to address the emerging challenge.
Exactly.
So it's not including the totality of policy decisions that may have been.
No. I think that the best reflection of the policy, the budget per se, and then Treasury manages throughout the year how to cover that, including pay downs for prior years payables, right?
And then
that's what they're juggling with.
And then the scope of the fiscal year, essentially the de facto definition of essential services is basically the appropriations and the obligations reflected in the budget excludes debt service, and the balancer is taxpayer refunds and vendor payments.
Mm-hmm.
Driving on that question, could we go back to your slide number 6? I just want to be sure that we're clear on the starting point for a fiscal plan, and basically looking at the highlight that you have there for February. So basically, you project that the TSA cash will be at $104 million. And at that moment, when the moratorium law expires, there's $1.3 billion of accrued and unpaid debt that will become due and payable at that moment in time. But that picture is missing two other components which you showed us on the fiscal year 2016, which are what is the amount or the estimated amount of checks that have been issued are on the board as long as that policy continues. And then second, what is the projected or estimated best sense of the payable, because that would give us then the true picture of what is the negative cash that
Total cash demands.
total cash demands that will be encountered at that. And in a sense, that sort of gives us what is the starting point of a fiscal plan that could potentially start in February.
So, in the second bullet of that slide, when we mentioned that there's an expected end fiscal year 17 bank cash of 71 million, for that bank cash balance, we're estimating that this year there's it's not that we're estimating that the cash flow projected by Treasury incorporates approximately 300 or 400 million of AP pay down. So
Accounts payable pay down.
exactly. So from the starting balance of 1.4 plus, I don't recall what was the number of checks in the vault against those 244. I think it was 350, if I'm not wrong. So we assume that accounts payable are actually going to be decreasing because part of the non-payment of the debt will be used in accounts payable pay down this year.
But you're referring to June. I'm trying to get back to February, which is the starting point. So in that sense, I mean, would the number of checks issued at the vault, would it be roughly about $350 million, what you mentioned?
No, the number of checks, the latest number we have for June, for February, are more around 250 million.
250 million.
Yes.
And then if we add to that,
And I need to validate that number, but that's my best
just
recollection.
your best estimate, so we
Estimate.
could get a sense. And then the accounts payable in February, I mean, more or less, it would be about the 1.4 billion that you just mentioned?
Yes, because then I'm assuming that most of the pay down is reflected in the cash, in the banks, in the checks outstanding.
And they're not reflected in this chart. So the middle, the February 2017 doesn't reflect the $250 million
No,
of checks.
this is position of cash in the bank, not book value of cash.
Okay.
So you will have a position in the bank of roughly 100 million, but you have $1.65 billion, which is basically the sum of checks that have been issued and would be in the vault, plus the $1.4 billion of the account receivable, that's $1.65 billion, plus the $1.3 billion of debt that hasn't been paid to date. So that, in a sense, that would give you your start point.
Yes. I mean, I want to be clear. We're showing a picture that for me is very critical. However, every entity and every organization carries on an amount of accounts payable. So
There's a normal working capital level that you
I don't
theoretically
think
should.
that
not, yeah.
assessing a total deficit, including the full amount of accounts payable, I mean, it could be a full chaotic downturn situation, right? But I think that there's always revolving basis of invoices to be paid that any organization maintains, right? The question here is if we want to maintain it at 180 days payment or lower it down to 90 days or a number that can let the Puerto Rican suppliers also carry on with the business efficiently, right? So that is a question that you need to address when you want to really understand what is the total cash.
So actually, have you done that calculation at a 90-day normalized payment cycle? What would be the working capital requirements and accounts payable for the Commonwealth? Back in the late 80s, when the trans were initially sized, that was the way it was done, and it was back then in the order of $500 million. It has to be much more now, presumably. But do you have a sense of what the number might be?
I think that it should be around 500 to 600 shortfall.
600. So it's about.
But it will also, so that's my short answer, and that's my best estimate. And the reason why it's an estimate is because it also depends on the future budget or the current budget, how much is your base of payments to suppliers. So how you manage your expenses will also help you to manage the, but that's
Yeah, it's
number
an
that.
estimate. But it's certainly not less than 500 million normalized working capital, I think, yeah.
If I may, I think part of the reason why at least I go to accounts payable is because as we think about budget and as we think about cash, sometimes looking at previous cash and forecast cash is a way of validating whether or not the budget numbers make sense in terms of the size of the whole. And in that context, looking at a portion of accounts payable as being kind of, near-term due, and it's in a budgetary measure in some ways, or to address a cash measure that addresses near-term budget constraint is kind of helpful. And so I think in my mind, as I just want to make sure that I'm getting kind of the bottom line of roughly what the cash is telling us and what the cash is telling us around generally what the ongoing structural budget shortfall has been, and as a way of having a frame for the $5 to $7 billion projected deficit that is in the fiscal plan. So just a few questions on that point. So if we look at this roughly, what I think it's telling me is that in the last few years, the Commonwealth has been looking at basically structural shortfall of, in the $2 to $3 billion range that has basically gotten rolled forward with a combination of cash measures and which include non-payment of vendors and delays of vendors. Is that kind of roughly in the order of magnitude?
Yes.
And then, so as about, this fiscal year, essentially the non-payment of debt service has been how the Commonwealth has been paying for what it's been paying for, and in addition, and it still has obligations above that, and that's where the delay in vendor payments and the delay in taxpayer refunds kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
And as we think about kind of so generally, and as we've seen from your presentation, we don't see the budgetary measures embedded in the base that would close that structural gap that's roughly in the $3 billion range. And you also note that that gap is getting larger, at least because of ACA, and larger because of 154. So that kind of is adding another, about $2 billion in a budgetary sense. And the other element that is affecting, yeah.
Can I break?
Yeah.
And I think that there's one point there that I want to clarify from our end. Our assessment is a general fund. There has been a real clear effort to neutralize the continuous deficit on a budgetary basis, but that will be reflected as we go on. I think that, as I mentioned before, there's a number of special revenues and non-general fund funds that have had a life of their own based on special legislation and laws that were created, some of them assigning specific additional revenue lines for those funds, and those are not being managed by Treasury, or those have their own life and separate life. In my opinion, in order to really get a hold of the deficit, we need to vet those, understand them, and eliminate the recurring deficits. Some of it, and the government, and we vetted a portion of that. The government identified a number of those funds that were traditionally captured or generating cash flow movements outside the TSA or outside the scope of OMB, and we have included those as recurrent expenditures in this year's budget to formalize the fact that there's a recurrent expenditure going and make it visible. I think that OMB has addressed that issue. It's a really good step forward, but I think that there's still work to be done to contain that set of non-general fund funds. So when this is to just clarify, when you were saying, we see that there hasn't been a lot of measures to contain the current situation. I mean, those are measures that have been put in place and I think are very favorable. But then, yes, there's still work to be done.
Thank you. And I was just trying to say that it's not like there are measures that are embedded in the base where there's an expectation that the structural shortfall is going to be closed in the near future based on policy that's already in place.
Correct.
So, okay, so generally, the order of magnitude of the budgetary, when you talk about the walls that we're looking to hit in the foreseeable future here, or in the very near future, we're basically looking at a cash wall that's roughly in the $2 billion range in February, growing to about $3 billion by year end. And then we're looking at that wall worsening based on anticipated federal changes, as well as based on and if the Commonwealth is to continue honoring existing pension obligations, and the scope of the status of those funds, we're looking at that picture worsening by another few billion. So so roughly we're looking at, if we use cash to approximate budget, we're looking at, 3 to north of 3 this year, and growing by those measures by several billion.
Approximately, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, let me further, if I may, Ms. Mendoza Santos, break that out, because I want to be sure that I follow the math. Because I mean, when I see the picture on slide number 6, and you take out assuming no debt service, and if you assume, as Mr. Garcia mentioned, a stabilization on the accounts payable at 90 days, that would roughly mean that the true cash deficit, it's about $1 billion, excluding debt service. And then you have on top of that, I mean, whatever the debt service may be. Obviously, that doesn't include all the challenges that are coming in that you have in the presentation about ACNA funding and some of the other revenues. But the true picture right now, it seems to me, that the true cash deficit, excluding debt service, it's roughly around $1 billion plus the debt service.
Which is the two, and so that we were discussing with.
Okay.
Or I was understanding from your calculation.
Which is always very helpful when we get to it from different perspectives and we arrive at a similar.
Okay.
That's the same calculation I was doing when validating Ms. Mendoza Santos' estimations.
Does anybody have any further questions? Alvaro and Wade, thank you very much for your presentation and for your very sobering presentation. Thank you.
Very, very
Thank
helpful.
you.